our honorable panelists to join us on the high stage. And let me begin by thanking all of you for being part of this event. So let me begin by asking Honorable Madame Geraldine Mukeshimana, Minister of Agriculture and Animal Resources of Rwanda, to join us on the high table. Thank you very much. I would also like to ask Ambassador Dr. Kipego Cheluget, who's Assistant Secretary General of COMESA, to join us. He will also be joined by Professor Simon Roberts, who's the Executive Director, Center for Competition, Regulation and Economic Development, University of Johannesburg.
And that is why we have assembled a very eminent panel from both sides of the aisle, both from the government, private sector, practitioners, etc. I hear that water is life, and I agree with that. But if you are not resilient, you drink only water, you can only last for a few days. But I want to add that food is the actual life, because without food, you will die after a few days, especially if you are not strong enough. So it is important that this afternoon we are discussing about food. But not just food, but intra-African food trade. I'm not going to say so much in this introduction because our panelists are the experts. But permit me to say that we have problem of production, which is that we can gain from areas that have had successes and what they have done or are doing to ensure that we increase intra-African food trade. Because as we already know, if we do this, economic growth will not only increase, will also solve the problem of food insecurity. Areas with deficits will have surplus, and at the same time, will attract investors in the sector. Without much ado, I want to stop there and turn to the honorable panelists. And I want to start with the honorable minister by asking her to enlighten us on the main barriers that she thinks are hindering intra-African food trade, and possibly educate us on what Rwanda's experience is in terms of finding solutions to these key barriers. Honorable Minister.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you everyone for having me and having this meeting in Rwanda. So we greatly appreciate your presence here. So, and I think my question is the toughest question, but when you look at the food trade in Africa, probably the first question that will come in mind is, are we having enough production in terms of quality, but also in terms of quantity? Because when you look across, we still have many countries that are having food deficits in terms of quantity, but also whatever is harvested, probably not all of that can get to the market because of the standards, quality, and safety associated with that. So that is probably a barrier that is starting within us. But that is also associated with the second one that I may call probably it's associated with the human capital and the knowledge, because this food is produced by the farmer. Are we sure that the farmer has the right knowledge to produce the food that is enough in terms of quantity and quality? But the whole food value chain, it's not only the farmer. There are post-harvest handling, there are transport, there are value additions, and most of that, there is also issues associated with human knowledge, but also capital in terms of finance to do that thing in the right thing. So that is also another barrier, and most of us, we fear to develop our own private sector, assuming that we'll get the private sector from somewhere else, and then we don't do the right thing to do the training and invest in our own people to be able to do this, especially when it comes to agriculture, which is done in the rural areas. So it's only our own people who belongs there, who are born there, who can go there and understand the issues that our community are facing. So I find that failure of developing our own private sector in all value chains being another big component of what we do wrong. But if we want to go out of Rwanda, I mean, all of that Rwanda is doing, trying to raise the productivity per unit to make sure that we are producing enough, but also investing in research and extension for the people to do what's right, and also invest in young people to make sure that we are developing the private sector across the board. So we have a maturing of private sector, but you know, the new faces keep coming in, and it's important that the government works with the private sector to make sure that we are also tackling the issues of private sector development. And when you go out of Rwanda, there are, I mean, if we start by our neighbors, trade structures is like you have a lot of informal cross-border trade, and you have the other trades across, I mean, out of the continent. So majority of what trades are informal, others are out of continent, which means probably we even have a lot of informal that we need to formalize, because we take it as granted, but probably we need to formalize that and know that we are making some, I mean, intra-Africa trade that we don't count. And that comes with the issue for data that was mentioned a few minutes ago, that probably we do a lot of informal and we don't have the right data to know what we are doing. But probably out of our region, there is a big, big issue for remoteness. I mean, sometimes if you want to go to Senegal, you have to go to Europe and come back. If you want to go to somewhere in Morocco, you have to go to France and come back. Why would, you would assume that if you are shipping your food items, it becomes so expensive to ship them to your neighbors, I mean your African neighbors. It's more expensive than shipping them to another continent. So that remoteness, I find it a huge barrier to inter-African trade. And I mean, Rwanda has been trying to develop our own airline. Rwanda is going in most of the countries in Africa, in West Africa, but we used to suffer a lot when we wanted to go to West Africa. So you can imagine if you are sending your agricultural commodities to West Africa, it can be really challenging. The last item that I want to talk probably is associated with ourselves, the human nature or the mindset. I mean, when you look at what we import and what we export, most of the time you know that we are importing cereals, and probably we are exporting flowers, or we are exporting cocoa or coffee or something like that. So you find that the traditional exports, they had a specific destination because in Africa we did not develop infrastructure or the processing capacity to add value to our own commodities. So that I find it an issue that probably we need also, it goes along with investing in our own private sector to make sure that we are having the processing capacity of our commodities. But the human mindset goes beyond that because we sign all kinds of trade agreements, we do harmonize the way we do things, but when it goes to implementation, we don't implement that. So you find that human capital, or human being is we are creating our own barriers among ourselves, and it's, you feel like, so since we have negotiated this and we have signed it, why are we struggling to implement it? So doing what we committed to do, I think that is a huge barrier as well. So I have so many of them, but I don't want to take so much time, and thank you.
Thank you so much. I can't even hear that. Please, another round of applause for the Honorable Minister. Thank you very much. That was illuminating. Highlighting the major issues, major barriers to intra-African trade, and telling us what Rwanda is doing. I won't attempt to summarize at this stage and at the end, but I want us to proceed by also looking at, because she mentioned the fact that we have signed so many agreements, and we know for example, that we signed in 2003, the Maputo Agreement. In 2014, we signed also the Malabo Declaration. And the problem had been implementation. Are these policy related? Maybe I will ask our next panelist to enlighten us. What are the problems in relating to policies in terms of implementing the agreements that we have had? And I think I'm going to go to one of the people who had been in the field in COMESA, because that will enable us to know their own experience. And I'm going to the ambassador to give us some insights on what he thinks are the barriers to implementing these agreements, particularly as they relate to policies.
Thank you. Thank you very much, moderator, for that. Yeah, indeed, at COMESA, we have a very good treaty. We have a treaty that really covers all the areas to enable trade to happen in our region. And if we were to strictly apply the COMESA treaty, I think intra-Africa trade would increase, or intra-COMESA at least. We have also in COMESA have institutions that work to try to increase intra-Africa trade. So for example, we have Alliance for Commodity Trade in Eastern and Southern Africa, ACTESA. We have the Africa Leather and Leather Products Institute, which is based in Addis. And let me also say that we implemented the CADA process together with the African Union with a great deal of success, I must say, because by the time we stopped, we had about 15 or 16 countries who had signed their compact. So again, you may ask what happened with the CADA process. Then I think the answer is that also over-reliance on development partners for funding our activities is really our undoing, and that is one of the major handicaps that we face. Now, let me also say this, that we have this perfect arrangement, legal framework that is there. We're supposed to trade amongst each other, and one of the things that have been liberalized is, of course, agricultural products from one country to the other one. But for many years, small-scale traders, for example, crossing the borders, were referred to as smugglers. And it turns out also that most of these people are women who see that there's a market maybe across the border in eggs or in milk or in whatever agricultural produce there is. Now, but then we come in and introduce SPS issues, which also becomes a challenge, whereas SPS could actually be a very good thing, because then we would have to adhere to certain standards of safety and hygiene. It also tends to be a handicap in promoting intra-COMESA trade or intra-Africa trade. To solve this problem, COMESA even established about 3 laboratories that
also
exist to address the issue of the SPS. Now, but then you ask yourself, how come then trade is still very minimal? I think yesterday we talked about the poor infrastructure across the borders. That still continues to be an issue. But I'll just give you some few examples. As far back as 2003, there was a thriving trade between Kenya and Zambia on milk. But then because of SPS issues, this was stopped. The two parties viewed this as one party was seeing this as an SPS issue, the other one was seeing it as an NTB. But it's taken so many years to try to resolve this, which is really, really unfortunate, because this could be one area or one very good example of how intra-COMESA trade would have really flourished despite this. Now, you may also want, yesterday I think we talked about sugar. And one of the participants here, I think, told us that those people who deal with sugar are very rich. But then the people who grow sugar are very poor. So why shouldn't a farmer in Uganda or in Rwanda grow sugar and sell it to wherever the market is? Well, you'll find that we still have a list of sensitive products, and sugar is listed among them. And perhaps we can ask ourselves, does this really help our intra-COMESA or intra-Africa trade when we continue to protect certain products? You'll find that you may not be able to succeed in promoting trade. So you'll find that traders from as far as Brazil bring their sugar and still be able to sell it very cheaply in our markets. And it's really a very big question that we need to address. Now, let me also say this, that COMESA is collaborating with other institutions, and I'm happy to say that one of the institutions that COMESA intends to work with very closely is AGRA. Recently, I think AGRA had the annual meeting here in Kigali, and I think AGRA has been able to mobilize other development partners and so on. So I think working together with the governments of the region, we may be able then to work to open up the spaces and to increase intra-Africa trade and actually improve the livelihoods of our farmers and make food easily available to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Another round of applause, please. Louder. Great. Thank you very much. We are live. Now, the Honorable Minister mentioned one of the regulatory issues, bugging intra-African food trade. He made mention of the SPS versus NTB. The question of also having some products protected, making it more expensive for local producers and cheaper to import. I want to therefore ask our next panelist on the issue of regulatory and legislative issues relating as a barrier and what he thinks can be done about this. And I want to go straight to Professor Simon Roberts. Since he's at the Center for Competition, he will probably let us know way out or the nitty-gritty issues relating to these regulatory and legislative issues, bugging intra-African food trade.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be here on this very important panel. As you would guess, yes, from the title of the center, which is Center for Competition, Regulation and Economic Development, we believe that analyzing markets means understanding the nature of the competitive dynamics in those markets and the market power and the interests. And so when we're looking at a market, and often these markets should be cross-border, but they may not be because of these barriers, we can see that while there's blame laid potentially on regulatory barriers or on government measures, in actual fact, there's a set of industry interests, of trading interests, that are making a lot of money out of these price differences. And this is not an irrational thing, in other words. In other words, the fragmentation that we see that is continuing is actually continuing because certain interests are standing to make a lot of money out of that. And in the context of the changes that are coming with climate change, as well as the growing demand from urban consumers for certain types of products, I think we're at a stage where we're at a turning point where if these issues are not addressed incrementally or by by larger moves, then we will not realize any of the objectives which have been set out. I'm going to give some examples from some regional value chains that we've been looking at in maize and soya, wheat and fertilizer in Southern and East Africa. But just overall, I think I also want to highlight that when we're looking at these things within the value chains, we're looking at the value created along the value chains, we've got to be seeing this as part of the wider structural transformation challenge in terms of are we able to industrialize through agriculture and agro-processing? Because as urban consumers are growing their demand and buying more processed foods, if we don't see this as part of an agenda to develop manufacturing of those processed foods and the linked capabilities such as in packaging, then we won't be meeting the preferences of those urban consumers. And no matter how much we might say that they should not be there, that is inexorably the demand patterns that we are seeing happening. So overall, there are changes that are going on, very positive changes we've seen in some segments, but the big picture, I think, if we're honest with ourselves, is that if anything, over the past 10 to 15 years, there's greater fragmentation occurring within regions. Why do I say that? Well, if you look at the price differences of wheat or soya or maize or fertilizer in countries which have a common border, those price differences have got larger. And if you're moving across the border and there's a market there, you can move, you can buy on one side and sell on the other. That should not be the case. Now, some of them are sensitive products, and so there's been tariff barriers and protection that's been put on place. Trucking costs are there. We know trucking costs are 2 to 3 times what they should be if we compare with Latin America. We're not comparing with Europe or industrialized country. If we compare with Latin America, study after study continues to say the trucking costs along the corridors are 3 times. we have to choose. Do you want to protect your trucking industry, which often is a cartel, an association, or do you want to support the transport of food products, because the trucking industry is a cost for farmers? So the impact is that it's very difficult for farmers to reach a wider market, and they're burdened with these costs. And we have this fragmentation, which is not a question of research. It's really a question, we sometimes say, we don't really do research, we do investigative journalism. We just look and we ask, what is the price? And then we ask, who is controlling the supply? And that's why informal traders are called smugglers, because the market, the formal markets are being controlled, and there are private interests that are at work. I promised to myself I was not going to talk about sugar, so let me not talk about sugar. But there's a long history there of issues. And I think the highlight I want to make is that it's very expensive to be a farmer, because the farmer is buying fertilizer, which is transported, and which has been sold in many cases by explicit cartels internationally, but has also a local transport cost. And the farmer has got to transport those produce to market, has got to pay for that transport, and has to pay for storage. So it's very expensive to be a farmer in Africa. And that's the base. In the context of meeting the demands from urban consumers, we've really got to look at where that demand is coming from. In terms of the value chains that I'm talking about today, I want to just highlight the changing demand for meat. And essentially the two main ones we should be thinking about is fish and poultry, aquaculture and poultry production. It's the most efficient conversion of protein, but the competitiveness of those industries, in which there is a lot of value creation potential, a lot of employment potential, can't be there unless you have animal feed. And animal feed is, in most countries, about maize and soya. And so if we can't address the productivity challenges improving and the investment challenges improving that production, then we can't complain about the fact that we're importing poultry and importing tilapia, which we are doing from other markets, if we are not putting in place those steps. But there's been some very positive moves in soya. So let me just say what has actually been going right in some cases. Just one case study, which I'll go into before finishing. The places to grow soya in southern Africa, the best places are countries like Zambia. If you are in Brazil, that will be a region inside the same country. So meeting the demand in Sao Paulo means growing it about 1,500 kilometers away in another part of the country, and they've been very successful. In southern Africa, it means meeting the demand in Johannesburg and growing it in Zambia. You have to cross two borders. South Africa has been happier to import poultry and animal feed from Argentina or South America than to import it from Zambia. But the industry associations have actually driven a dynamic of change, a private sector-led initiative, which has led to Zambia trebling its production of soya and has led to it landing animal feed in Johannesburg below the Argentina price, and has made the South African poultry industry more competitive. This is regional integration in practice. And it's been coming on the backhauls of the trucks from the South African supermarkets. So the trucking prices have halved because they've been filling the trucks that are going backhauls. Uganda is also exporting soya in East Africa. We haven't looked at that closely, so I can't say whether that's the same dynamic. But who's been driving these initiatives? In Zambia, the National Farmers Union has got to set up price transparency. You can see what the prices that are quoted in different parts of Zambia right now, this week, by buyers. There's a commodities exchange which has added to that. The initiative on trucking has happened, and the poultry industry has also come in on the buyer side. So it is possible to dramatically change this dynamic, and a trebling of production of soya, of which around about 40% is small and medium farmers, has diversified the agricultural base in Zambia. So these things are possible, but they are unfortunately the exception that proves the overall rule or the overall picture. So in terms of a package of measures, I think we have to start talking about particular value chains and supply chains across particular sets of borders, bring together a package of measures which open up these markets. And the steps are starting to happen. Commodities exchanges.
Also, who are dealing with some of these issues from a friend at the Kofi Annan Foundation. From what have been discussed so far, what do you think will be the strategies for African countries to enhance trade, given these kind of barriers and the issues that have been raised so far? concentrating on what you can call strategies and frameworks going forward.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? I have a very low voice, so let me know if you can't hear me. Allow me to explain something that I've been getting a lot of questions. Why is the Kofi Annan Foundation, a small entity, involved in this exercise? You know, the late Mr. Kofi Annan was the first chairman of AGRA, the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa. When it was created, we will deal with that matter. Similarly, high potential production country. And Cargill accepted his proposal, and they were dealing with smallholder farmers, where they provided seeds, financial services, and they also had an offtake because they had processing facilities. Again, Cargill bought 7,000 tons of maize. They had the market. There was shortages because of drought in the neighboring countries. They couldn't sell the 7,000 tons, and probably the program stopped. At that stage, he decided to address this issue by looking into an and have a scale to make a difference. The whole of West Africa was rice. So what do we do to overcome this? And including, we should keep in mind that, as we have been informed yesterday, population in Africa, my recommendation or my